We're diving directly into one of the most radically subversive epistemological frameworks surviving from classical antiquity, early Pyrrhonism. This isn't merely a methodology of casual doubt or a debate over human sensory limitations. Grounded squarely in the surviving testimonies of Pyrrho of Elis and his disciple Timon of Philius, this is a philosophy of absolute non-cognition. The text we're examining today advances stunning thesis. Reality itself fundamentally lacks any determinable character. It's a complete surrender of the mind, strategically utilized as a dialectical weapon to dismantle any dogmatic philosophical system claiming to possess objective truth. We'll be closely analyzing the primary fragments to see exactly how these ancient thinkers systematically deconstructed the very concept of certainty. Here is the structural architecture for our explainer. We'll start with the thematic thesis of non-cognition, trace the historical context of Pyrrho's life, analyze the literary style of the surviving texts, dissect the internal ethics and logical progression, and finally evaluate the text's enduring transmission and legacy. Section 1. Let's establish the foundational thematic theses of these texts. To truly grasp the early texts, we have to understand their core theoretical stance regarding the physical world, which they explicitly define as strictly anapikrita. This is a critical concept. The texts are not simply arguing that human cognition is biologically defective, that our eyes play tricks on us or our ears mishear things. That would imply there is a real, measurable truth out there that we're just failing to grasp. Instead, they make a massive ontological claim. The universe itself is inherently inarbitrable and completely unmeasurable. External reality has no fixed objective measurements for us to capture in the first place. You cannot accurately judge or arbitrate reality because reality fundamentally refuses to be defined. When you read the fragments, you see this term deployed to systematically strip away all human capacity for objective judgment. If the object of your study is inherently formless and indeterminate, any attempt to categorize it or claim absolute knowledge about it isn't just slightly wrong, it is fundamentally void. Section 2. We need to situate this radical text within its historical and cultural context. Pyrrho's chronological environment maps roughly from 360 to 270 BCE, and the biographers note that he initially studied under traditional philosophers like Anaxarchus of Abdera, but the textual evidence points to a massive geopolitical and cultural disruption as the catalyst for his philosophy. Pyrrho joined the military expedition to India with Alexander the Great. It's during this massive cross-cultural mobilization that the ancient biographers claim he encountered the gymnosophists, or the naked philosophers of the East. This exposure to entirely foreign ascetic practices and different ways of conceptualizing the world essentially shattered his traditional Hellenic dogmatism. The text suggests that observing the extreme imperturbability of these Indian ascetics directly shaped Pyrrho's subsequent formulation of his own radical detachment. He wasn't just sitting in an Athenian academy theorizing. His philosophy was forged on the frontiers of the known world, synthesized from a collision of distinct cultural viewpoints that proved to him that all local Greek claims to absolute truth were entirely relative. Section 3. Let's analyze the literary composition and the specific style of the surviving fragments. We run into a fascinating structural divide in the historical record here. Pyrrho himself adhered to a Socratic oral precedent, meaning he wrote absolutely no systematic treatises. He embodied the philosophy entirely through his character and daily actions. Therefore, this entire textual tradition actually rests on the literary architecture built by his primary disciple, Timon of Philios. Where Pyrrho provided the living paradigm, Timon authored the foundational philosophical prose and satirical poetry that formalized the lifestyle into a highly defined textual tradition. Without Timon's meticulous systematization, the entire framework of early Pyrrhonism would have been lost to history. Timon effectively translated a behavioral disposition into a rigorous, transmissible literary canon. And Timon's literary style was extraordinarily aggressive. In his most famous work, The Soloi, a 3-book collection of lampoons, he explicitly weaponizes literature against dogmatic thinkers. What's brilliant here is his narrative device. He deploys strict Homeric hexameter, the most revered, authoritative epic meter in Greek literature, but twists it into biting parodies. He utilizes this exalted poetic form to mercilessly mock intellectual heavyweights of the era, including Aristotle, Epicurus, and Zeno. He creates this surreal philosophical underworld where the dogmatists are depicted as squabbling, arrogant fools obsessing over unprovable theories. Meanwhile, he carves out a specific intellectual pedigree by selectively praising predecessors like Protagoras, Democritus, and Parmenides, who he felt anticipated his skeptical worldview. It's a masterclass in using genre and style as a demolition tool, destroying the intellectual authority of rival schools through sharp, highly literate satire. Section 4. Let's dissect the rigorous internal ethics and behavioral philosophy championed in the texts. The fragments we have outline a highly mechanized four-step progression of virtue. It starts with an observational mandate. You must view all of reality as inherently adiaphora, completely undifferentiated and indifferent. Once you strip away arbitrary human categorizations, you move to step 2, applying the dialectical formula of umalen, meaning no more this than that. This is a logical neutralizing agent. For any argument someone makes, an equally valid opposing argument exists, rendering both null. This rigorous neutralization logically forces step 3, aphasia, or cognitive speechlessness. You literally just stop making bold assertions about what is true or false. You surrender the debate. And it's only through this absolute intellectual surrender that you arrive at the final teleological goal, ataraxia. This is absolute tranquility, a profound freedom from mental disturbance. The texts present this not as a mystical state, but as the inevitable logical consequence of giving up the exhausting, unwinnable war to define an undefinable universe. So how does this ethical framework dictate practical, daily action? If you've achieved this state of non-assertion, how do you even function? The texts are remarkably pragmatic here. Because the absolute absence of objective truth is established, human survival must rely entirely on local convention, habit, civic law, and practical appearances. You don't rebel against society, you conform to it, not because society is right, but because it's practically convenient. Crucially, this framework deliberately eliminates desire as the root of all mental disturbance. The texts argue that if nothing is objectively good or objectively bad in nature, agonizing over your desires is a profound logical error. If you stop desperately craving things to be a certain way, you navigate your environment purely by practical habit. You strip away the toxic, dogmatic desires that ruin your peace, replacing them with a remarkably calm, frictionless compliance with everyday phenomena. Section 5. We turn now to the dialectical progression and the internal logic driving the core argument. The systematic logic of the movement is perhaps best preserved in Aristocles' report on Timon, which boils the entire philosophical endeavor down to 3 rigorous sequential questions. First, what is the exact nature of things? Second, given that nature, what psychological attitude must we adopt toward them? And third, what will be the inevitable outcome for those who maintain this attitude? This isn't just a casual inquiry, it's a tight dialectical funnel. It systematically forces the practitioner to evaluate the foundational ontology of the world, deduce the only logically sound cognitive response, and recognize the teleological result. Every argument in the early Pyrrhonian texts is essentially answering one of these 3 structural questions, driving the thesis forward relentlessly. When the texts answer that first question, what is the nature of things? They map out a total, inescapable cognitive failure by contrasting human perception directly against external reality. On one side, human sensory perceptions and opinions inherently fail to deliver any absolute truth. They are constantly shifting and contradicting each other. But the critical argument, represented here in the second column, is why they fail. The texts assert that things in themselves are naturally astathmetha, meaning completely unstable and unweighable, and anapikrita, entirely devoid of objective form. Our senses aren't just missing the target, there is no target to hit. This systemic refutation of counterarguments is vital. They cut off the dogmatists by proving that even if we had perfect, godlike senses, we still couldn't determine the truth, because the universe fundamentally lacks any determinable character to be perceived. This brings us to the dialectical answer to Timon's second question: what attitude must we adopt? The only logically sound response is epoche. This is the total, unyielding suspension of judgment on all claims regarding objective existence, justice, or value. Within the text's internal logic, this suspension is not portrayed as a weakness. It's not a hesitant reaction to sensory defects. Instead, the authors frame epoche as the ultimate act of empirical accuracy. If you inhabit a universe that is demonstrably indeterminate, then suspending your judgment is the only philosophically rigorous thing you can do. To make a definitive claim about an unmeasurable world is to lie. Therefore, epoche functions as the central conceptual motif of the entire text, a deliberate cognitive paralysis that paradoxically aligns the human mind perfectly with the chaotic reality of nature. Section 6. Let's conclude by examining the historical preservation and enduring legacy of these texts. Throughout the 3rd century BCE, Timon's writings dominated the skeptical landscape, and we can track their structural impact on rival Hellenistic schools. His arguments regarding tranquility heavily influenced the Epicurean concept of detachment, and his views on indifference directly shaped the political philosophy of the heterodox Stoic, Aristo of Chios. More importantly, Timon's core dialectics were appropriated by Arcelius, who used them to pivot the entire Platonic academy towards skepticism. However, this textual lineage eventually faded until a massive archaeological and literary revival in the 1st century BCE by a philosopher named Anicetus. Anicetus meticulously compiled and systematized the surviving fragments of Timon, single-handedly resurrecting the radical early Pyrrhonian framework for a new era of thinkers. Because these texts were heavily debated during the transmission, a major biographical schism emerged regarding how this philosophy was actually lived out. On one side, we have the sensational accounts from the biographer Antigonus of Carystus, who claimed Pyrrho's absolute skepticism made him completely reckless, allegedly walking into oncoming wagons and ignoring sheer cliffs because he wouldn't judge them as objectively dangerous. But Anicetus fiercely critiqued this in his later compilations. He rigorously defended the texts, maintaining that Pyrrho suspended theoretical judgment regarding absolute truth, but never acted recklessly regarding practical, daily details. Anicetus argued that early Pyrrhonism was entirely compatible with self-preservation through adherence to local custom. This textual debate highlights the enduring friction within the literature, the incredibly thin line between profound philosophical consistency and sheer practical madness. Ultimately, it was Anicetus' strategic revival of these primary texts that cemented the legacy of early Pyrrhonism in the history of secular epistemology. The surviving fragments fundamentally shifted the ancient literary landscape by arguing that ultimate mental peace is found exclusively in absolute cognitive surrender. They leave an indelible mark on how we understand human knowledge. And as we evaluate this rigorous, ancient framework today, it leaves us with a truly provocative question. If every absolute truth you aggressively defend is merely a local custom, masking an entirely indeterminate reality, what exactly are you fighting for? And what profound tranquility might you achieve if you simply suspended your judgment?